All right, well, today we are in the second part of what we like to call a series here. So if you're new here, we take our messages and we like to group them together under a common theme. And over the past week, we've been talking about Lent in a series we're calling Re-Lent. Now, before we dive into it, I'll catch you up a little bit. Think about this, all right? Have you ever been misunderstood? Yeah? Maybe a few times this morning? Yeah. So what happens, and maybe you wouldn't explain it this way, but what happens is there's certain words that I use to kind of paint a picture, right? And a misunderstanding happens when those same words paint a different picture in the person that I or you are speaking to, right? So let's say you're a parent and you have a teenager, and that teenager says, "I'll be home at 7." And their words paint a picture in your mind of 7 p.m., but they're thinking 7 a.m., right? That's a good example of a misunderstanding. One time, this is one of my earliest memories, I was in like preschool, and I remember being in the car with my parents. I'm sitting in the car seat in the back. We pull up to this bagel shop, and my dad turns around and he says, "Hey, what kind of bagel do you want?" And he listed off a few bagels, and I said, "Sesame." And he goes, "Okay," and leaves the car, goes into the shop, and I'm thinking, man, this is gonna be great in my little preschool mind. Now, I had been to a bakery that was right next to that bagel shop, and I had seen what they had done with a cupcake. Like, they would take this red frosting and put eyes on it, and it would be Elmo. They also did Cookie Monster, Big Bird. And so I'm like, well, how are they gonna capture Sesame Street in a bagel, right? And so you can probably imagine how disappointed I was when they brought out this plain bagel with seeds on it that belonged on, the seeds belonged on a hamburger bun in my mind. And so I was pretty disappointed, right? The picture in my mind was one thing, and what actually was a different thing. This is often the story of church for a lot of people who don't go to church. This was my story for years. I would talk to someone who had a really positive experience in a really healthy church, and they'd be like, "Oh, you just gotta talk to God." And when they would say God, they're picturing something really positive, someone that cares, someone that's understanding, like someone really good. And in my mind, I'm picturing this authoritative rule giver who's just trying to stop me from having fun. And what happens with misunderstandings, where they're really dangerous, is when you don't know they're happening, right? In fact, this is kind of off topic, but I would suggest if you're someone who's been in the church for a long time and you talk to people about God, when you say God or Jesus or church or sin or any of these Christian buzzwords, there's probably a misunderstanding happening. There's probably a different picture being painted. And that was the story for me with church, but it was also the story for me with Lent. Lent. Now, if you don't know, Lent is that period of time leading up to like Holy Week, right? And so during Lent, what a lot of people will do is give up certain things and focus more on how they need to change. They'll pray more, maybe fast, maybe give more things away. And for me, I was like, no, like not my scene. I'm not excited about Lent to begin with. It's during the worst time of year. Like, no one likes this time of year. We're all tired of the cold and we're ready for the warm, but it's not quite here yet. It won't go away. There are no Lent songs. People aren't excited about Lent. It's very gray, and to make things like real nice, apparently God wants us to give up things we like chocolate, And so Lent for me was like, no thanks. But really, this distaste for Lent came from misunderstandings about certain terms, concepts in the church. And so what we've been trying to do over the past week is redefine some of those terms, because there is so much value in some of these things that keep people keep so much distance from. Like this idea of sin that we talked about last week. Sin is like, a lot of people don't like that word. Why? Because of the picture that's painted when they hear the word sin. If you're like me for a long time, I think of, angry God telling us not to cross the line because he doesn't want us to. We might have too much fun if we go do what he doesn't want us to do. And so in my mind, sin is wrong. But James, who is the brother of Jesus, reframed it for us, like clarified for us. Like, no, it's not wrong. Like, don't think of this as God putting you to the test. Like he's tempting you to see, well, what's he gonna do? No, he's like, this stuff is deadly. He says, sin it's wrong, it's toxic. It has a gotcha. It'll hurt. And so anytime here, if this is your church home or you decide to make it your church home, you have to understand anytime this word comes up, this is where our minds need to go. Not to some sense of arbitrary right and wrong from the cosmic killjoy in the sky. And so last week we talked about that. And where we ended was in asking, okay, well, what do we do with this then? If sin is toxic and we all have sin in our lives, or at least some of us believe that there is something called sin and it's in our lives, what do we do with it? This week, just for fun, I went on Google. You know Google? Yeah. So Google's great, super efficient, likes to save time, and so you start typing and they want to guess what you're gonna say. All the bars pop up, like you can put ice cream and it's like ice cream shop, ice cream dish, and it puts all the most frequently searched terms. So just for fun, want to see what else people were thinking about church. So I typed in, church makes me feel. And I wanted to see what do you think it said? Anybody? Go ahead, yell it out. Guilty. Guilty. Somebody from the first service was like, horrible. Sounds like you're having a good morning so far. Glad you're here. So the number one thing that came up was uncomfortable. The second thing was guilty. Guilty. Now I know this, and I've told you this before, but this is just church is people equate church with feeling bad, guilty, inadequate, just like buried in my insufficiency. I am a pastor, all right? I work in a church, and I've told you, if you've been here for a while, I don't like telling people I'm a pastor because things get weird right away. Unless I have a relationship with them already. If it comes up, I have a little strategy. If they ask, what do you do for a living? I just say, I work in a church, hoping maybe they think I sweep up after, right? And then if they say, well, what do you do there? Then it comes out, I'm like, I'm a pastor. And then it's like, oh, okay. And they start thinking about how many times they've cursed in the last 5 minutes. Like I'm sitting there keeping track. One of my friends who's actually was in our community group, she started coming to the church. She got excited. And then she started telling her friends about it. And then she came back to our community group. She's like, you want to know something? People get weird when you invite them to church. And I was like, yeah, that's my life. Because there's this discomfort. People feel guilty when it comes to church. And so there's really two extremes. There are two directions often people go. One is to be like, well, fine. Maybe there is someone up there and when I die, I want to be on his good side, and so I'll just live here. And we just carry the weight of inadequacy, never feeling enough, because it just comes with the territory. Or we get tired of trying to live for someone you cannot please, and we just say, forget it, no more. I don't want to talk about my shortcomings. Don't bring up sin. I don't want to go there. So it's either we give in or we totally push it out. What's interesting is that Jesus did neither of these two extremes. And the way forward is really neither of these two extremes. People who were nothing like Jesus wanted to be around him all the time. People that made horrible decisions wanted to be with Jesus. The villains in society wanted to be with him. He wasn't just beating people up, but at the same time, he was real about their shortcomings. And you know this, whether you believe in God or not, you know you can't have a healthy relationship without addressing issues. What sins, mistakes, whatever you want to call it. You can't be a good parent without addressing issues. You can't thrive emotionally without addressing issues. Broken patterns, negative ways of thinking, bad habits, whatever you want to call them, the way forward it can't be to ignore them. So what do we do? What do we do? When most people say they feel guilty, most often what they're actually feeling is something that we call shame. And understanding the difference between the two is humongous when it comes to dealing with the issues in our lives. And so we got a little chart here that might help clarify some things. See, if we can define shames, and some of this is semantics, right? Depends how you define these words. But if we define shame as like not living up to a standard, recognizing when we don't live up to the standard that we want to be living at, and we define shame, that's guilt, and shame is the belief that I'm flawed and therefore unworthy of love, acceptance, belonging, connection, all these things that we need to survive, then guilt is actually, it's tied to an action. It's tied to something that I've done. And it's very clear. Apart from that action, there is no guilt, right? Shame speaks to an identity. It's not what I've done, it's who I am. And so, because of that, guilt is very specific. You know, when you feel guilty, you know what you feel guilty for. Tom left $5 on the stage, and so I picked it up and I put it in my pocket, right? I feel guilty. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't feel guilty. It's very specific, right? Shame is this vague feeling of just not measuring up, and it can apply to any area of life. It can apply to your professional life, your relationships as a parent, any and every area of life. Just this feeling of, and it's vague, and that's usually what people are talking about when they're like, that's how church makes me feel. It's not, I don't want to be here because I lied to my sister this morning. It's this feeling, not specific, like I'm just not what I should be. Guilt is way more rooted in a fact. You can feel it, but it doesn't have to be a feeling. Guilt can be like a status, like you can have guilt and not feel it. But it's tied to a fact. Like there's the line, you either crossed it or you didn't, right? It's black and white. Shame is way, way more rooted in a feeling because it's tied to a belief. The belief that your imperfection makes you unworthy of being accepted, of being approved of, belonging, connection. Because of that, guilt corrects. Guilt can be a bad thing if we bury it and live with it and just suppress it. It can start to grow ugly things within us. But it can also lead us to correcting. Whereas shame it leads to condemnation, to beating myself up. There are people that have walked into the church before. I've met them, shake their hands, and like, oh, I'm surprised the place didn't fall down the second I walked in. It's comes from this feeling of shame. Like God's just out to get you because just in general. One of the most toxic issues with this is that guilt focuses on your pain. If I have guilt because I've taken something from you, I have the freedom to care about you and what I've done. I feel bad because I took Tom's money, because of Tom not having that $5. But shame is inward. Shame is about me. Shame is about me not measuring up. And so shame then leads to all sorts of toxic behaviors. This is best illustrated if you ever want to study the beginning of the book of Genesis and see what shame does. It causes us to fake, to cover ourselves up, present versions of ourselves that we aren't really. It causes us to avoid one another, to blame one another, and it's because it's an attack on our identity. But guilt, simply recognizing that what I did doesn't line up with where I want to be, that can lead us to a healthy place when we know what to do with it. And so it's so important. It is so important. You know, like if I have an issue with one of my kids and I just like snap on them or yell at one of them or say something I regret saying, if guilt takes the reins there, then I'll feel bad about what I said. I'll be unhappy with what I said. I'll recognize that something has not lined up with what I have decided is appropriate behavior, what I believe to be appropriate behavior. But if shame sets in, well, then it's not about what I said, it's I'm just a bad dad. And if my wife comes over to me and says, you know, I don't really know how I feel about what you said to the kids, I heard, that's when I'm gonna become defensive. Because I'm defending my worth, my identity. Now, because they're so different, they have two totally different remedies. Shame is rooted in a belief. Like I said before, one way to define shame is that shame is the belief that I am flawed and therefore unworthy of love, acceptance, belonging, all these things we need. But we believe that Jesus, the gospel, like the reason why this is the answer to the deepest aches of our hearts, is because Jesus says, like, yes, you are flawed, but in spite of that, you are completely loved and accepted because of what he has done for us. It kind of breaks the category. And so shame, we actually did a whole series on this, and we can't totally unpack the idea of shame. But shame requires some real deep inward work, understanding your identity and understanding who God says you really are. That is the way to be freed from shame. But guilt is actually something we can address from the outside. Guilt is something we can act our way out of. We can take steps toward getting rid of. And the benefits of this are huge. The way to get rid of guilt is with this is an exciting one. Something we call confession. Confession. Now, take like your ideas about confession, just like imagine you put them in a box and just set it aside for a second. Confession, if you just strip the word down, it simply means to state something. So we have confessions of faith in the church history. You're stating what you believe. You can confess your sins, which is to state your shortcomings. To be open about where you've fallen short. John was a really close friend of Jesus, and here's how he explains it. He says, if we confess our sins, he, talking about God, is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. Now, there's a lot of religious jargon in there, but the idea, purify from all unrighteousness, this means to change. The beginning of change is taking a hard look in the mirror, looking at what we're doing, how we're living, what I've done in the past 24 hours, what I've said, how I've felt, how I've expressed that, and recognizing, was there a place there where I've fallen short? There's this old prayer, it's called the prayer of examine. It's this idea of, at the end of the day, going through your whole day in a prayer. And if you're not somebody who believes in all this and you don't pray, even just going through your day and saying, okay, where have I fallen short there? It requires a hard look in the mirror. David, if you've heard of David from David and Goliath, who later became King David, he would pray and he would say, God, search me and know me and show me if there's wickedness within me. Not wickedness like shame on you wickedness, but wickedness like, am I living in a way that is toxic that maybe I don't see? And when we confess that, when we bring it to the surface, John would explain, when it's not hiding in the dark, but it's brought to the light, there's this sense that it just loses power. And the guilt starts to dissolve because God forgives us. Now, I've told you before I can be a little critical. I like to poke holes in ideas, especially when I was more skeptical toward the whole idea of God and faith than I am now, right? And I hear that and be like, okay, so when I sin, I just ask God for forgiveness. Just go to God, say, God, I'm so sorry. So Tom goes up here, I don't like the song, so I just smash his guitar, say that was a stupid song, and then break it and leave. Now, if I confess my sins, he's faithful and just to forgive me my sins and cleanse me from all unrighteousness. So I go home and I say, God, I'm so sorry I smashed Tom's guitar. Then I come to work the next day. I'm like, hey, Tom, I'm forgiven. Right? Jesus described sin as a debt. And God is responsible for the good in the world. And so when I do something that's not good, in a way, there is a debt that I owe to God, right? However, there's also an outstanding debt with someone else, the person that I've offended, right? I mean, think about it. How crazy is it that we can hurt someone and then go to someone else and ask for forgiveness? I mean, if it was anyone other than God, it would be pretty crazy. And so Jesus actually addresses this very thing. He says, therefore, if you're offering a gift at the altar, now he's not talking about a church altar, like he's not talking about the front of a room. He's not saying go from the back row to the front row. He's talking about the altar in the ancient Jewish temple. For some Jewish people, ancient Jewish people, this would have been a journey that takes several days, walking. If you ever walk for several days, you're probably in a minority because nobody does that because it's very, very hard. And so some people literally would have walked for days to get to the altar to go offer a gift or a sacrifice. Now, in that culture, you offered a gift for one of two reasons: to say thank you to God or to say I'm sorry. And in the context of what Jesus is talking about, he's talking about those I'm sorry gifts that you give to God when you mess up, because that's what they did in that culture. And he says, so if you've taken a trip, for some people could have been days, and you're here going to say sorry to God for the things that you've done, he says, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you because you smashed his guitar. He says, he doesn't say pray for them. He doesn't say make sure the first thing on your list when you get back is to go meet with them. He doesn't say pray that God helps them to feel better. He says leave it. Stop. Like, we're not gonna play these games here where you can hurt someone and then go to God and say, I'm sorry. He says, leave it in front of the altar. And then first, he says, go and be reconciled to them. Then come offer your gift. Go fix it with them. James, who's a brother of Jesus, he said, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you would be healed. This is rare. This is hard. What Jesus is saying here is that we need to prioritize owning our shortcomings with one another. Saying, I'm sorry. Recognizing the pain that we've caused. And trying to do something about it. Doing this, it literally can change your life and relationships. Being someone who is good at owning your slice of the pie, whether it's 10% or 90%. This is the thing that Jesus wants his followers to do. And this is the kind of thing that heals relationships, but it is so rare. Probably because so many of us carry shame and feel the need to defend ourselves, but that's really a different story. But it is so rare to apologize, to genuinely own it. And when you do that, like at least acknowledge the outstanding debt with the person, it brings healing to the relationship, often instantly. Simply acknowledging that you're wrong. And so, it's really never too late to do it. There's never a time that it's not okay. And that's how you find healing from the mistakes you've made in the past. If you feel bad because you weren't around to tuck your kids in, whether it was a year ago or a decade ago, Jesus would say the way that you handle that is by going to them and saying, I wish I could have been there. If you feel bad for the way a relationship has turned out, the way you heal that is by owning it. It's amazing in the church world, like often people who go to church feel this pressure to do everything right and never be wrong. And so we run from owning our junk. But it needs to be the other way around. It literally can change your relationships, at least change a conversation. Recently, I don't know, about a year ago, I was leaving my driveway, and there's a stop sign at the end of the road, and then I have to make a left right after the stop sign. It's a back road, and so I very efficiently just kind of decided to roll right through the stop sign, and it was terrible. If you saw it on tape, it was just a horrible turn, nothing legal about it. And there's this car coming the other way, and this lady slams on the brakes. And then she rolls down the window. I was like, oh boy. And she looks at me, and she goes, there's a stop sign there. And she's just on fire. And I don't think she knew that I lived in that house. Thank God, because I don't know what she would have done. But she's like, there's a stop sign there in case you didn't see it. And I looked at her and I was like, you are absolutely right. I'm so sorry. And she was like she just relaxed and just went on her way. Now, I wish I could say that's always how I respond. But just seeing that, it was a powerful lesson to me. Really, the reason why I did that in that situation is because I've seen people blow past that stop sign. That's where my kids play. And so when someone called me out on it, I recognized the damage that could happen. But it taught me the power of just saying, my bad, I'm sorry. Maybe it's for something that happened a minute ago. Maybe it's for something that happened a year ago. You know, the reality is, there are some people in this room who could have had a dramatically different childhood if one of their parents would have embraced confession, would have been willing to look in the mirror and be real about what they see, would have been willing to pray in a quiet place and say, God, show me where I'm falling short. It could have been the start to a process of being purified from all unrighteousness, as John would write. And though they probably didn't know it at the time, you needed their confession, and they didn't give it to you. You needed them to do that, and they didn't. There are people in this room who have relationships that could have been dramatically different if the other person would have embraced confession, but they didn't. So you're paying for it. There are places where you've worked, where the outcome of your situation could have been dramatically different if the person on the other end would have embraced confession and been real about their shortcomings. But they didn't. So you paid for it. And so the question then is, who needs your confession? Who needs that from you? Who needs you to look in the mirror and be real about what you see? Knowing that when we bring our issues to God, we are forgiven because of what Jesus has done for us. That there's no condemnation. But we need to go to the person on our own and own our shortcomings. We have no idea what hangs in the balance. So maybe it's a phone call you need to make. Maybe it's a lunch you need to plan. Maybe it's with the person sitting right next to you. And the conversation is one you could have in the car ride home. But what if we were the kind of people that embraced saying, I'm sorry, recognized outstanding debts, we're real about our shortcomings? Maybe then when you type in, the church makes me feel on Google, you'd start to see some different answers. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here, but here's the story I want to leave you with. So when I was 16 years old, all right, and I'll change or leave out the details of this story for the sake of privacy. When I was about 16 years old, I did something really stupid and selfish. And it was a secret. Nobody knew until it started to feel like people were going to find out. And so I came out with it. But I blamed it completely on someone else who was involved. It was probably the slimiest thing that I've ever done. And it cost that person a lot. It messed up our friend group. It messed up his reputation. It ruined our relationship. Eventually, the next year, he left the school. Now, I don't know if any of that was because of what happened with us, but I don't know because our relationship was over. And I couldn't look him in the eye because he knew and I knew, but nobody else knew. And any time I would hear somebody bring up guilt or confession or being real about falling short or hurting, this was the story that came to mind every single time. And so I one day picked up the phone. I went on Facebook, found this person's contact information, like a creepy stalker kind of way, and reached out to apologize. Now, that was when I was 16. That apology, it happened in the church parking lot in 2021, 15 years later. I called him up and I said, hey, I did something and I lied about it and it cost you a lot. And there's nothing I can do, but I want you to know how sorry I am. And that I recognize the pain that it caused you and the price you had to pay for it. And he was nice about it. He said, yeah, it was really rough at the time, but you know what? Our lives ended up fine, and thank you. Now, I'm not telling you that story to pat myself on the back. That wasn't the brave thing to do. The brave thing to do would have been to apologize 15 days after it happened. In reality, 15 years later, there was very little on the line for me. But what I do want you to know is that it is never too late to pick up the phone, to plan that lunch, schedule that meeting, to be someone who's willing to recognize where they have fallen short. It's never too late to apologize. And the reality is, we have no idea what hangs in the balance of us being willing to say, I'm sorry.